Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I am the author of 11 books, CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy and social networks. Most importantly, I've been an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most substantially, too significantly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically the scientist behind uncovering how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories such as the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr. B, to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule. And look, if you've been listening, you know there's a lot more to that. I'm really trying to just refine this brief introduction so we can really get down to the nitty gritty. Obviously, if you want to know more about me, all the links are always in the bio, so please do check them out. As has become custom with each episode, we've been diving into one of my books, and specifically we've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. Now look, we're going to be continuing today our pattern on functional movement, and I think the one we've got in store today is really important, fundamental, but also exciting. So please do buckle in and enjoy today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's episode is 3.4, Functional Movement Power. Now, if you want to follow along, we're on page 115. It's probably so important to begin with and to, recap functional movement in and of itself that we started now 4 episodes ago on functional movement because we had our center of gravity, our range of movement, our momentum, and number 4 is obviously today on power. And you can see how it's been, I think, a progression because we want to make sure we are incorporating our center of gravity to begin with. Then we want to make sure that we're incorporating our range of movement, right? And then, yes, once we've got our range of movement, then we want to begin to incorporate, obviously, momentum. Now, the next step up is that if we're familiar with the building blocks and we're being mindful of that, we get to power. Now, it's incredibly important to critical to touch on that if we begin to focus on power before we've set ourselves up for that success, before we've built, I think, those other optimal performance practices, essentially we're setting ourselves up to develop an injury. Which I'm sure is not really what you want to hear, but in the most simplest, I think, way, that's what happens. And it happens, I think, to an exorbitant number of athletes out there when I think the key steps are overlooked. And that is why it's so important to integrate functional movement to begin with, to be mindful of functional movement patterns of play to begin with, to integrate these into our techniques. So for the coaches out there, when you're obviously coaching a new technique and the different fragments, the different discrete skills of that technique. Recap on prior episodes when we touched on discrete and serial skills. Recall that it's so important that once we've obviously completed that skill, so to speak, that not only are we incorporating functional movement and let's say those rulers to guides into our game, into those techniques, but then we're able to look at something such as power. This is something that is not just overlooked, it's something normally rushed to, because naturally, if you are that child or adolescent learning a sport and you're progressing through, I think, the sport, and you're excited to learn that skill, of course you are going to want to hit that ball as hard as possibly you can. There's obviously a lot of psychology behind that as well. And I think each and every one of us can understand that no one's going to pick up a tennis racket specifically and just gently hit the ball over the net if we had those tools to hit it harder and harder and harder. And I think more often than not, power can be misused, but it's also, I think, understood as that hardness behind the pace of the ball is often perceived as that power, whilst that level of control with the ball, of how we adopt and integrate functional movement into our game, takes a backseat. And so what happens when power takes that precedent? And this is specifically, I think, for the parents and athletes out there. Coaches too, if you're not familiar with this, but many of you may be. But what happens, obviously, if we overlook, I think, that the fundamentals there, and let's call it our technical blueprint, our foundations to our building blocks. And what happens when we allow power to take precedence is not only do we develop injuries, whether they're immediate to long term, it varies, depends on, I think, the sister factors, which we've also discussed. When I think power is put front and center, it's typically only temporary, or that player athlete can get quite frustrated when that power is not correlated directly with their results. Now, you only have to look at some of the best players on tour, is that there is never a case for just purely power that correlates with results. There are some exceptional players in the top 30, top 20 in the world that have never broken into the top 10 for this very reason. Which from a scientific standpoint, it's really exciting. From that playing coaching standpoint, it's incredibly ironic, because often power is misperceived as directly correlated with performance gains. But if you do not have the other performance metrics integrated within your game to your technical foundations, it does not happen. And I think that's why it's so pivotal to get it right. And when we say to get it right, is that we understand what power is, where it comes from, why we can apply it, why we can integrate it, and how it comes about to begin with. And once we have those building blocks set up that are allowing us to develop an optimal performance and obviously reach that level of success, we can obviously nudge the dial further and further and further. Okay, unlike the previous episode, I haven't gotten too carried away here. Just a brief recap to make sure I think we're familiar with the other functional movement markers that have been discussed. And since power is obviously number 4 here, we really want to be mindful that we're including, I think, different functional movement metrics, if you like. And we are being mindful that the role that each individual one plays in a player's athlete's game and their overall conditioning to that technical framework, but their performance. Because without trying to get too complex, when we're focusing on developing that optimal performance that, directly follows, I think, that trajectory to be correlated with a top 10 ranking on the WTA and ATP tour, we want to make sure that we're getting it right. And when I say we're getting it right, that you're understanding, whether you are that parent, the player, the athlete, the coach, the fundamentals we need to begin to integrate within our game. So if you'd like to follow along today, we're on page 115. The role of power in sporting performances is often misconceived as the be-all and end-all. Power itself is relatively easy to create. And now I'm going to stop there because I think this is so misconceived and it's so rewarding at the same time. Because the win here is that you might be naturally quite strong. So the belief is that you can create power quite easily. Though the fun part is that you may be the exact opposite. And especially, I think, for women out there, and when we're looking at, the women and the men, and the correlations there with power, it's not necessarily the case that you cannot produce a certain level of power. Obviously, when we're looking at more intricate measures from testosterone levels to estrogen, obviously men have higher levels, and that is why they can produce power in higher amounts at higher levels. But we're not here to talk about that. That's just a quick, I think, clarification. So power, though, can be more easily and readily applied when we follow the functional movement patterns, which means if we are already incorporating that mindfulness around our center of gravity, and we've been progressively building that range of motion, and we are incorporating momentum, power is in fact a natural byproduct. Here we go. In order to create power through functional movement, players need to be conditioned to move naturally, opposed to trying to literally blast the living daylights out of an object and or move an object without purpose. So specifically in tennis here, we have the case where, whether you're that junior, that high-performing player, you're on tour, it is often misperceived that you want to hit it hard as you possibly can, and I think the other markers go out the window, and that is a huge misconception, because if those markers do go out the window, that means not only is the athlete becoming more susceptible to developing a potential injury, it means they're negating, their functional foundations. Now, when we are more mindful of those foundations, we are more skilled and able to produce that optimal performance metric. And that is so incredibly important, because the irony there is when we try, there's obviously something, not quite right along the way, perhaps. But when we're not trying and we allow for that natural release, more often than not, I think the benefit can be exponential in respect to building and continuously building, those key markers to produce, those levels of power. Now, what happens if we're just looking at thumping the ball harder and harder and harder? We often forget our technique and those markers and our functional movement parameters, those specific discrete skills we've been working on. Oftentimes we regress back to our hardest hitting point because to us it felt good. Whereas if we can recondition what feels good through integrating those functional patterns of play and build that, that power relationship there, and that's what feels good, that's when we get to more naturally up the ante. Where there is purpose, there is thought and thus control. And through control, athletes are more readily able to move functionally. Through functional movement, power comes naturally, something that is often misunderstood and neglected in the world of sports coaching and athlete player development. Examples of how power is applied will follow, and how the use of this power is most optimal when athletes apply functional movement. This is, I think, it really captures what's been shared about that common misconception. And what we've done here is that we've pulled out some common, I think, ball sports that obviously have some similarities with tennis, and we highlight the correlations there between power, functional movement, and obviously the outcome of play. And we can learn here by going, it's not just in tennis, it's obviously in other sports when we're talking about functional movement techniques, how we develop power, how we use the body to get to the point where this happens. Now look, the most exciting and I think rewarding element here is that once you reach a level of play where functional movement is the norm, where you are conditioned to produce, I think, power that's complemented by your momentum, which is further complemented by your center of gravity and the awareness around your range of movement, then you are setting yourself up for success. And you're setting yourself up to reach that optimal level of play. And from that point onwards, are you more equipped and conditioned to continuously, nudge the market further and further when it comes to that level of power? The first sport we're going to touch on here is baseball. One of the best examples of the production of power is evident in baseball players. When swinging into the ball, making impact, and at times with the intention of quite literally belting the ball, baseball players are well known for wanting to hit the ball hard. The necessity of functional movement is high. Players who are equipped to move functionally have superior results in contrast to those who neglect the importance and simplicity of functional movement. Now look, this is so important, and we use this because I think there's no better example for a tennis player, specifically when we're looking at our ground strokes, to also narrow in on that baseball player. And obviously it's reciprocal in many cases. So you look at that power output, every baseball player will have the specific technique, their point of contact, to how they follow through the ball. Obviously there are quite significant technical variances there. So if we're really just focusing on that point of impact, we refer to it as. Now that point of impact, and I guess the amount of power, and we can look at the distance to where they're able to, I guess, allow that ball to flow or fly, land, is correlated with how their body moves, because it is a rather stationary position up until that point. Now, for the tennis player, we can learn that obviously to get to that point where we can use our power to that optimal level, we need to be so conscious and mindful of our technical patterns, which means, again, we look at the baseball player. Now, if they're releasing that level of power and their technical variance is off, as in they make contact whilst outputting extreme levels of power, and something becomes misaligned, well, one, obviously the result is not going to be the desired outcome. But two, if they compromise their body under that level of stress and through that level of power, they become incredibly more susceptible to developing an injury. Now, this is obviously a baseball player who does not, in no way, shape, or form, hit as many balls as a tennis player, because that is one moment in time. That's one inference there. Now, a tennis player to win 1 point, you tell me how many times it takes you to hit that forehand and or backhand for that to happen. And that's absolutely excluding when we're talking about contact with a serve or the return or the approach or the volley and other elements of play. When we're specifically focusing in just a point of impact on a ground stroke, drawing that obviously the similarities there with that baseball player, the number of impacts, so the number of points of impact is incredibly high. Sure, the level of pressure can be argued to be quite different. Obviously, the technical variances are quite different. The tools in play, obviously, from a bat to a racket are incredibly different. The pressure of the balls are incredibly different to their makeup, etc., etc. So we're not talking about that. We're merely talking about that point of impact and the similarities there. But the argument obviously is that we can look at someone under that level of stress, producing that level of power. And what we can learn in tennis is that if you continuously contact a ball at an increased level of power, negating that level of technical awareness, negating to implement functional movement patterns within those areas of play. So within, I think, your specific technical foundations there, of course you are more susceptible to developing an injury because you are going to be producing and performing that specific stroke over and over and over again. Now, the amount of times you could hit your forehand and or backhand within a 2-hour training period, specifically if that's what you're working on, something specifically to do with your ground strokes, you're going to obviously make contact with the ball in the high hundreds to early thousands, if not more. And it is exponential in that respect when you're looking at power and pace. Now, your rallies could be quite short. It could be 3 to 4 balls. But if you're putting all that all your power behind that ball and your technique is compromised throughout that 2-hour period, obviously for you to develop an injury or a level of soreness that goes on to develop into an injury, it is so incredibly high, the likelihood of something developing that's detrimental not only to your game but to obviously your level of play. So it's so important and fundamental to develop, I think, those foundations, because irrespective if it's just that 2-hour window and you're focusing on power opposed to the building blocks of the techniques that are responsible for producing that optimal performance, that also is more powerful and leverages your actual body to produce that opposed to muscling the ball, and looks at mitigating injury. It is worth it. It is so worth it, because not only does it set you up for the long game, it allows you to follow that set trajectory. Now, just on that, when we're looking at power and pace and how important it is to be mindful of, I think, those functional movement patterns of play within that 2-hour window, if you're specifically just looking at hitting the ball hard, more often than not, your body is not all involved, so all encompassed involved. And what I mean by that is that you are not specifically using your frame, you're not specifically integrating those other functional movement parameters. You are being mindful of your center of gravity, your range of movement, your momentum, etc. You're obviously glued in on, you're zeroed in on that power and that level of hardness. And more often we see players muscle the ball, we call it, through their upper body. And you will see this on tour, WTA and ATP, doesn't matter. You will see it on the ITF, you will see it at academies, you'll see it at developmental players, it does not matter. It happens across the entire sporting spectrum. And what happens here is that an athlete's lower body is neglected. The movement is no longer whole. It is half, so to speak, because athletes are not being taught, more often than not, how to use their lower body in collaboration, in conjunction with their upper body, which sounds ridiculous because we just have that one body. And so we're hitting the ball, we should be using our whole body, but that is not the case. We can departmentalize here and say there's a lot of work involved in positioning and setting up your lower body, which is incredibly fundamental. That is where our building blocks are. That is where our power comes from. And specifically from that, that scientific perspective, where the kinetic chain is so reliant upon. And that is obviously responsible for developing that kinetic energy. But without getting, I think, in the more complex side of the biomechanics, etc., we're going to simplify and go, if we are not using our lower body, then no, our level of power that we are producing is then specific to, obviously, the mechanics of our upper body. Now, our upper body has not been designed to take that brunt, to take that load. And that is why, more often than not, you see so many juniors to, the high-performing players developing those upper body injuries, whether it's, the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist. Because all you need to do is look at an athlete's lower body and see if they've been putting in the work, which is incredibly concerning, disheartening when I step on a tennis court from afar, look at a tennis court to see players there, and you're able to see that their lower body is being neglected. A few months ago when I was at a local academy, there was maybe, 0.1% of players, and that's being incredibly generous, who were actually using their lower body. And the coaches there were incredibly oblivious to this, unfortunately. And I think it gets to a point which I really should clarify, that you can only offer advice so many times before you can just make it available that if you would like help, you can put your hand up, which essentially was the case, because all of these players and the parents there mistook results as a really good thing, opposed to building those foundations so their child would still be playing the sport in 10 years' time. The sad thing is, and we know from obviously that scientific perspective, that if you are conditioning an athlete or player to rely on their upper body, specifically in those junior years, and they're not being taught how to move as a whole, the likelihood of them lasting that 10 years is incredibly low. So imagine how many children, and we're talking about in the hundreds of thousands, if not, and that's probably just from a local standpoint or domestic standpoint, which means if we're talking across the board, those numbers are incredibly staggering. So if you're at that, that child, that athlete, player listening, and you have your hopes set on the long game, on one day developing a top 10 tennis ranking, it is so critical and is so fundamental to integrate, to condition your lower body. The upper body is not responsible for power. The upper body is responsible for control. And that is so often overlooked, because if you're putting the work into your lower body, your upper body is directing that. So it's directing the power. It is responsible for making contact with the ball, with the racket, right? And the specific, discrete serial skills involved there, and executing them to the desired level, to how you've been conditioned to make contact with the ball. The lower body is so integral to putting in the work that is behind that. And irrespective of, again, what level of play you are at, if your lower body is not being included, integrated, we can talk about the direct correlations there about not developing a top 10 ranking, about not becoming a Grand Slam champion. We can talk about the direct correlation there of, yes, developing an injury. We can talk about the correlations there about, yes, not being poised for, on that trajectory towards the top 10. If you are not using your lower body, we can talk about why you're stuck and stagnated at, 80, 70 in the world. If you are not using, your lower body in conjunction with your upper body, and you're not understanding, I guess, that interconnecting the work there, the relationship there, the dynamic there, we again can talk about why you're 800 in the world and stuck, not progressing further, or you're ranked 120 in the world, and why it's so hard for you to break into the top 100 and so forth. There are so many direct, I think, inferences here when we're talking about power and functional movement, and from a results perspective, how detrimental it is. And all we need to do is look back at our local tennis centers, clubs, academies, the coach education framework. If you are privy to, obviously, the secrets to optimal performance success. If not, get your hands on it, please do. It's so incredibly fundamental to have those building blocks, because if you are that player athlete out there and you have been putting in the work and you want to become a professional tennis player, learning how to use your lower body is absolutely integral. And it takes time and it takes work, and we're not talking about days to weeks, we're talking about months, because we need to recondition, to condition how your body moves through movement. It's different when we're looking at a movement that is static, which is essentially sitting on a chair. That is not the case when we're looking at that dynamic music where you're constantly moving and interchanging the dynamic of tennis and play. We need to condition that movement over and over and over again until it obviously reaches that point of autonomy, which is often not the case. Or more typically, an athlete is taught a skill and the focus stops being on that skill before that level of autonomy is reached. It's typically stopped shortly prior. So when that athlete or player is placed under pressure, they revert back quite readily to that prior static skill, so to speak, as just to simplify here. So when we want to integrate power, again, being mindful of those functional movement patterns, it's so integral, specifically when we're looking at power, to incorporate, to include, to develop that lower body to begin to produce those optimal performance metrics, specifically when we're looking at developing that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. To get a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AM8 International. That's am8international.com. For any comments or questions, again, head on over to AM8 or Topic Thread. That's the only social network I am on. We do have accounts. Beyond Top 10 Tennis is on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter to LinkedIn. So if you are on any of those platforms, please reach out and also say hi. I may not receive them all. I will try to, but I would absolutely love to hear from you as well. If you'd like something different, then please head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. Look, all of the links are in the bio and the show notes. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, follow, and like. That would be absolutely phenomenal. Also, if you are on, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, we are a little bit late to the game in that respect. So I would personally really appreciate your support and getting the word out there, because at the end of the day, not only are we mitigating injuries in athletes around the world, specifically when we're looking at tennis, but also setting up the next generation of play. Whether you are actively on the WTA or ATP tour heading towards the top 10, we want to set one another up for success. If you are 800 in the world and you want to progress towards the top 100, that's what we're here for. If you are that aspiring player, no ranking points yet, but you want to get there, we're building the foundations to get you there with the long game. So irrespective of what level of play you're at, sharing beyond top 10 tennis, specifically from that scientific perspective, we're here to help. So the more we get to share that, the better. On that note, I am so grateful, and thank you so much for those of you who have been following on from the start. I hope we have been getting better. Your feedback is incredibly appreciated. Please do keep it coming. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.